Nobody at the Pell County Children's Home ever caught who did it. Every Friday, before the sun cleared the mill roof, a single pair of stout children's brogans hung tied to the yard fence. The right sizes. The laces knotted twice, still smelling of fresh wax. After a while, the children stopped asking who left them. They simply decided a saint did, and they went on believing it. The way you believe in a thing you have never once seen fail you. The town had its own answer. On the courthouse steps, the men were sure. Has to be the Ardsley widow, one of them said. Nobody else in this county has money to spare. And that settled it, for years. 61 children, 4 winters, not one bare foot among them. And nobody knew why. Then came the Friday, the fence was bare, and the Friday after that. And when the county went to settle the shop of the deaf old cobbler, 2 streets over, the one nobody counted, the one everybody had written off, they found a ledger on his workbench. If you believe kindness never goes unnoticed, this story is for you. Before we go in, do me one small thing. Subscribe, so a story like this finds you again. And in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one. Now let me take you back. Cardwell, North Carolina. A cotton mill town folded into the Piedmont, where the Ardsley Mill ran the river, and the river ran everybody's life. It was the winter of 1933, and 1933 was not kind to a place like Cardwell. The mill cut its shifts, the county cut what it could. And out at the edge of town, past the last row of company houses, the Pell County Children's Home cut the tightest of all, because it had the least to begin with. The home was a long brick building, with a tin roof, and a yard fenced in gray pickets that leaned where the ground froze and thawed. Cora Halstead ran it. She was matron, cook, nurse, and night watch all at once. A broad woman with red hands and a voice that carried the length of a dormitory. The county paid her a stipend. Every year the stipend got thinner. Every year there were the same 61 children, or thereabouts, and the same long winter waiting at the door. Shoes were the worst of it. A child grows, a shoe does not. You could feed a boy on beans and cornbread and keep him alive on very little. But you could not send him out into a Carolina winter with his toes through the leather and expect him to come back with all 10. Cora had lain awake over shoes more nights than she could count. And then one Friday morning, she stopped having to. She found the first pair the way you'd find anything you weren't looking for. She'd gone out to the fence to unstick the gate. And there they were. A pair of children's brogans, good and sturdy, hung by their tied laces from a picket. Not new, but sound. Resoled, or made from something resoled, she couldn't have said which. Small enough for one of the little ones. She stood there in the cold a long moment. She looked up the road one way, then the other. There was nobody. There was the mill roof and the pale sky and her own breath, and a pair of shoes swinging a little in the wind. She took them inside. She dried them by the stove. She put them on the smallest boy whose own were worst, and she wrote nothing down. That was the thing about Cora Halstead, and it mattered later more than she would ever have guessed. She did not write it down. She did not ask. She decided, standing at that fence, that a gift was a gift, and that a person who looked too hard at a gift might scare it off. The children had no such caution. By supper time they had a story, and by the next week they had a saint. Some of them said it was an angel. The older ones, who knew better than angels, said it was a rich lady who felt sorry for them. But saint was the word that stuck, because saint was the word that fit the feeling. That somewhere out there in the dark and the cold, somebody knew their exact sizes and cared. Now I want you to meet a girl, because the whole of this thing turns on one small girl and her one worn-out pair of shoes. Her name was Ruthie Vane. She was 6 that winter, maybe 7. The home wasn't always sure of ages. She was a quiet child with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down, and by December her shoes had given out entirely. Her big toe pushed clean through the right one. Cora had stuffed the toes with newspaper and it lasted a week, and then it didn't. So Cora did what she'd learned to do. On a Thursday night, She set Ruthie's ruined little shoes out at the fence. She didn't tell anyone why. She'd figured out, without ever quite admitting it to herself, that if a worn pair went out on Thursday, a good pair came in on Friday. It had happened enough times now. She set them there like a woman leaving a saucer of milk on a step, half shamed, half hoping. Friday morning, Ruthie's ruined shoes were gone, and in their place hung a new pair. Ruthie's exact size. Not close. Exact, that was the part nobody could ever explain. Whoever it was must have measured the old ones, because they never once got the size wrong. Not once, in all the Fridays that were coming. A child could grow half a size between the setting out and the giving back, and somehow the giving back allowed for it. Cora noticed this. She noticed it the way you notice a clock is right, without wondering how it knows. Ruthie put on her new shoes and did not take them off for 2 days, not even to sleep. She told the other girls the saint had made them just for her, and she began from that Friday to want one thing more than anything else in her small life. She wanted to meet him. 2 streets over, on Ansel Street, there was a lamp that burned past midnight. You would not have looked at the shop twice. It sat between a shuttered feed store and an empty lot. A narrow front with a sign so faded you had to already know what it said. Croft, boots and shoes. Repairs. The front window was dark. It was always dark. That was the first strange thing, if anybody had thought to find it strange. The front of the shop never showed a light. But behind the counter, behind a drawn shade in the back room, a lamp burned. And in the yellow of it, a man sat bent over a bench, and his hands moved. I won't tell you his name yet, the same as the town wouldn't have. I'll tell you what you'd have seen through a crack in that shade. You'd have seen a man of middle years with a scarred face, the left side of it pulled and shining, the ear on that side a ruin. You'd have seen him take a child's worn-out shoe, a small ruined thing, and set its sole down on a sheet of brown paper. You'd have seen him trace around it with a stub of pencil, slow, careful, catching the exact spread of the toe where the child's foot had pushed widest. Then you'd have seen him reach into a bundle of men's uppers, factory rejects, seconds, leather nobody wanted, and choose one, and take a long, thin knife and begin to skive it down, to pare the thick men's leather thin enough, small enough, to become a child's shoe. He worked without a sound, because sound was a thing that had mostly left him. And he worked without stopping, deep into the night, while the rest of Ansel Street slept, and the rest of Cardwell decided who their saint must be. He never lit the front of the shop, remember that. It's the kind of small true thing that means everything. Later, because while that lamp burned in the back, the town out front was busy being certain. The Ardsley widow was the favorite. She had money, or was thought to, and she went to the Methodist church, and it pleased people to imagine her creeping out before dawn to do good in secret. When that theory got tired, there was the Methodist ladies' circle. Surely a whole circle of women could keep a secret and stitch shoes between them. And when that wore thin, somebody floated the mill owner himself. A guilt gift, they called it. Conscience money for the shifts he'd cut. That one had a nasty little pleasure in it, and it went around the courthouse steps for a good month. The man who floated the most theories was Vernon Slode. Slode was a county commissioner and a mill board man, and he was the kind of person every town keeps at least one of. He liked a ribbon to cut. He liked a name he could say out loud at a gathering, this good soul, this fine benefactor, and he liked it best when the name was one he'd had a hand in announcing. Slode did not so much want the children shod, as he wanted a story with an ending he could stand up in front of. It's the widow, he'd say. Mark me. Quality shows. And then, in the very same breath, as if to prove he'd considered everything and dismissed it, he'd wave a hand toward Ansel Street and add, God knows it isn't that deaf drunk in the cobbler's shop. Man can barely keep his own lamp in oil. That was Cardwell's whole opinion of the man on Ansel Street, delivered in a single line by a man who'd never once spoken to him. The deaf drunk. Nobody, A thing you dismissed on your way to guessing about somebody who mattered. And under all the gossip, the Fridays kept coming. A boy named Dell got a pair in November. A pair of twins got matching ones the week of the first hard freeze. The saint, whoever the saint was, did not seem to care what the courthouse steps decided. The saint just kept the fence full. There was one boy who knew more than the rest, though he never said. He slept in the end cot nearest the yard window, and he was a light sleeper, the way children get when their world has already been taken away once. One morning, well before the bell, before there was any real light at all, something made him open his eyes, and through the frost on the glass, he saw a shape at the fence. Stooped, slow, moving like a man who hurt. The shape reached up and tied something to a picket and stood a moment with its hands still on the shoes, and then it turned and went off down the road in the dark. The boy did not run and wake anyone. He did not tell the matron. He lay very still and decided, with the whole certain heart of a child, that he had seen an angel. And you do not tell people you've seen an angel. They laugh at you. They take the angel away by not believing in it. So he kept it. He kept it for years. It was his, the thing he'd seen, and it warmed him better than the blanket did. That was the winter of 1933, and the winter of 1934 after it, and they ran together the way lean years do. But I have to bring you now to a particular Friday, because it's the one that Cardwell never forgot, and it's the one where the town nearly lost the whole thing without ever knowing what it had. It was February of 1935. A brutal week. The kind of cold that comes down off the mountains and sits on a mill town and does not lift. And the children woke that Friday the way they always did now, with the little thrill of it, the running to the window to see what the saint had left. The fence was bare, empty, not a shoe on it. The pickets gray and plain in the gray morning, and the wind moving through them, and nothing. I want you to understand what that was, in that place, to those children. It had never happened. Not once. In all the Fridays any of them could remember. The shoes on the fence were as sure as Sunday. And now there was nothing, and a dozen little ones stood out in that killing cold in the yard, looking at the empty pickets, and not one of them said the thing they were all afraid of. That the saint had stopped. That whatever it was had finally run out, or died, or simply gotten tired of them the way everything else in their lives eventually did. And of all the mornings for it, a man from the county paper had come out that very Friday. He'd heard the saint story at last, the way a newspaperman does, months late, and he'd driven out before dawn with a camera and a notebook, meaning to catch the saint in the act. To finally put a face to the mystery and a name under a photograph. He caught an empty fence in a yard full of cold children. He wrote his piece anyway, because a man who's driven out before dawn writes something. And the man who gave him his ending was Vernon Slode, who arrived that morning smelling of opportunity. Slode looked at the bare fence, and he looked at the reporter's notebook, and he saw a story that needed closing, and he closed it. It was the widow, he said, grave as a preacher. Poor soul, I have it on good authority she's moved away to be with kin. And so the good she did moves on with her. A great loss to this county. He may even have believed it. Men like Slode have a gift for believing whatever lets them speak. And the reporter wrote it down. The Cardwell paper ran it that week. A tribute to the anonymous benefactor, believed to be the late Ardsley widow, whose quiet charity had now, sadly, come to its end. There was a photograph of the empty fence. There was Slode's name in it twice. The town read it and grieved a little and moved on, the way towns do. The saint was gone. The saint had a name now, more or less, and the name had been claimed and buried and credited, all in one Friday, by a man who came out to speak. And here is the truth of that bare fence, which not one soul in Cardwell knew. The man on Ansell Street had the grip. That was all. That whole week he'd lain in the back of his dark shop with a fever. Too weak to hold the knife. Too weak to walk 2 streets in the cold before dawn. He had missed one Friday in years, and he had missed it flat on his back, shivering, staring at the finished shoes he could not carry. He didn't know a reporter had come. He couldn't have heard the children in the yard. He only knew he'd broken his one rule, and it ate at him worse than the fever did. The next Friday, the fence was full again. There was no announcement of that. The paper didn't run a correction. There was nothing to correct, as far as the paper knew. The children simply woke and ran to the window, and there they were. A good stout pair hung by their tied laces, and the little ones cried, some of them from the relief of it. The saint wasn't gone. The saint had only been away. And Cardwell, having grieved its mystery for a week and given the credit to a dead woman, quietly took it all back and forgot the scare entirely. But the man on Ansell Street did not forget. From that week on, he worked ahead when he could. He kept a finished pair in reserve, against the day his body failed him again. He'd learned what a bare fence cost. He just never told a living soul that he was the one paying. Let me show you his hands now, because his hands are the only place he ever said anything true. Go back through that drawn shade one more time. The bench is a low, scarred slab worn smooth in the middle from years of the same forearms. There's an awl and a curved needle and a spool of waxed thread, the color of dark honey, and he draws the thread across a lump of beeswax before every stitch, so it grips and won't rot. There's a last, a foot-shaped iron form, and a whole row of them in graduating sizes on a shelf. Children's sizes, which is a strange thing for a shop that fixes mill workers' boots. There's a stack of tires in the corner. Old automobile tires, bald and cracked, gathered from the ditches and the dump. And you'd see him take a knife to one and cut long strips of the rubber, and shape them, and nail and cement them onto the bottoms of small shoes. Because a rubber sole off a dead tire will outlast leather 3-to-1, and it costs a man nothing but his hands and his eyes and his time. He was buying warm feet for children with garbage and skill. That's what those hands were doing. And above the bench, pinned to the wall where the lamplight fell on it, there was a sheet of brown paper with the tracing of a small worn shoe. A right and a left, drawn slow, catching the widest spread of a child's toe. It was Ruthie Vane's. Her outgrown pair, the ruined ones Cora had set out at the fence, he'd kept the tracing. He kept them all, filed and pinned, so that when a child's foot grew, he'd know it. So the next pair would fit exact. That was the whole secret of the sizes that no theory on the courthouse steps ever came close to. He measured the worn ones. He always had. By now, watching through that shade, you know who your saint is. You know it's the deaf cobbler, the nobody, the deaf drunk on Ansell Street, who never touched a drop in his life. You know it, and it sits heavy in you, because not one person in Cardwell knows it, and the one man who could tell them would rather die than be caught. I have to tell you about the summer of 1936, and about the money, because it matters later more than anything. In 1936, the government finally paid the veterans of the Great War their bonus. Men who'd gone across the water in 1917 and 1918 got, at last, the money they'd been promised and denied. In a mill town like Cardwell, it was real money coming into real houses. Men bought roofs, paid off the store, put something by. And nobody in Cardwell, not one soul, gave a single thought to what a deaf man with no wife and no children on Ansell Street did with his. But he got it. Because he'd been across the water too, though the town had long since stopped connecting the scars on his face to any war. $600, or near it. To a man living on about $5 a week from resoling mill workers' boots, $600 was a fortune. It was rest. It was a real stove and a full larder, and no more skipped suppers. It was the down payment on being an ordinary, comfortable man for the first time in his life. He spent nearly all of it in the next town over, at a leather merchant's warehouse, on sole leather and rubber and upper stock, bought by the bundle. The merchant remembered it for years, because it was such a queer thing. A childless man, a man with no shop to speak of, buying enough children's grade stock to shoe a school. The merchant had asked him what it was for, And the deaf man had just smiled his crooked ruined smile and paid and hauled it off in a borrowed cart and said nothing at all. Hold on to that. $600 turned into leather. It pays off in a way you can't see coming. The winters wore on and the man wore down. That's the part the town never watched. So I'll watch it for you. By the fall of 1936, the shop barely kept him. Risoling was slow. Folks made their own shoes last in hard times. And what little came in went right back out into stock and wax and cement. He was living on almost nothing. And the weeks the leather ran short, he ate less, so the shoes could get made. There were Fridays that the fence got its pair because a grown man 2 streets over went to bed hungry to buy it. Nobody set that against anybody's account, because nobody knew there was an account at all. The debt the town owed this man had grown enormous and completely invisible, and it grew a little larger every single Friday, in the dark, in silence. There was a Friday late in that year, I want you to have this one, when he worked 2 nights on a single pair. His hands weren't what they'd been. He'd taken a cough that wouldn't leave, a rattle deep in the scarred chest, and the awl slipped and the light seemed dimmer than it used to, and the leather fought him. But a boy at the home had worn through his soles, and the worn pair had come out to the fence on Thursday, and that was that. 2 nights. He made the pair in 2 nights that would once have taken him one, and he hung it, and he told nobody, and he coughed his way home before the sun cleared the mill roof. And the angel boy, he was near grown now, tall and awkward, still at the home, because the home was all he had. The angel boy followed him. He'd waited for it for years, half his life. That Friday, something woke him again in the dark, and again there was the shape at the fence, stooped, slow, hand lingering on the shoes. And this time the boy rose and pulled on his own shoes, a saint's shoes, from a fence years back, and he went out into the cold and followed at a distance down the road. He followed the shape all the way to the corner of Ansell Street. And there, in the last of the dark, the shape went to a narrow shop front between a feed store and an empty lot, and let itself in through a door that never showed a light, and was gone. The boy stood on the corner and looked at the dark shop. Croft, boots and shoes. And everything in him that had believed in an angel for all those years went quiet and confused. Because he knew that shop. Everybody knew that shop. That was the deaf man's place. That was nobody's place. The drunk. And a boy who'd carried an angel in his chest since he was small could not make the angel and the nobody be the same man. So he decided, walking back to the home in the cold, that he'd followed wrong, that he'd lost the real shape somewhere, and only imagined it going in that door. Because everyone knew that man was nobody, and nobody leaves miracles on a fence. He went back to bed. He said nothing. The truth had walked him right up to its own door, and he'd turned around, because the town had already told him what he was allowed to believe. And then came January of 1937, and an ice storm, and the night that this first half of the story ends on. It came down out of the dark on a Wednesday, freezing rain that glazed every wire and every branch and every gray picket of the home's fence until the whole town rang like glass when the wind moved. Roads closed. The mill sent its people home. On Ansell Street, the shop lamp burned in the back the way it always did, and the man at the bench finished the week's pair. Small brogans for a girl this time, salvaged rubber soles, laces he'd knotted twice out of long habit. He was slower than ever now. The cough had settled into his chest like a lodger. When he finished the shoes, he sat a while with his hand flat on them, catching his breath, and the ice ticked against the shade. Then he did a thing he did every Friday of his life, and had never let a single person see. He reached up to the corner of the bench where a small shoe stood by itself. Not a tracing. The shoe. A child's worn left shoe, only the left, the leather gone soft and pale with age. A little thing that had walked its miles long ago. He took it down and held it in both his ruined hands, and he did not weep, because he'd used up weeping a long time before. He just held it. And then he set it back exactly where it lived, square in the lamplight, and he wrapped the finished shoes in a bit of cloth. The storm was full up now. Any sensible man would have waited a day. The fence could take a Friday late. The girl could wait until the ice broke. But a worn pair had come out on Thursday, and Friday was Friday, and a promise made in the dark to children who'd never know his name was still a promise. So he put on his coat, and he took the shoes, and he opened the door that never showed a light, and he went out into the storm. And that's where I have to leave him, for now. On Ansel Street, in the ice, a stooped shape with a cough in his chest and a bundle in his arms, going out to keep a promise nobody had asked him to make. Because the next Friday after this one, the fence is going to be bare. And so is the Friday after that. He kept his feet under him on the ice by holding the fence line the whole way. 2 streets, and every step of it earned. The wind came off the mill pond and cut straight through the coat. He'd sewn that coat himself, patched the elbows with the same leather he used for uppers, and it did him no good at all that night. But he made the corner of the home's yard, and he found the picket where a worn pair always waited, and he tied the new shoes to it. Laces knotted twice. He gave them one last press with his thumb, the way a man tests bread. Then he turned back into the dark. I don't know how long that walk home took him. Nobody does. Nobody saw him go. But I can tell you what a pair of hands like his had already done, because the reckoning of it was still sitting in that shop, waiting to be found. You have to understand what those shoes cost him. Not in money, though money was thin enough. In the body. He was deaf and had been since 1917. An artillery shell had done it, somewhere in a French field he never named to a living soul, and the same shell had taken half the look of his face and left the rest a map of old burns. He came back to Cardwell a quiet man, in a town that had never been quiet toward him. Children ran from the scars. Men on the courthouse steps decided, the way men do, what he was. A drunk, a simpleton, the deaf one on Ansel Street. They said it easy, and they never once knocked on his door to check. He let them think it. That was the strange part. A man could have set them straight. He never tried. Because to Elias Croft, being thanked and being pitied were the same coin. And pity, he was certain, would let the town reach in and take the work out of his hands. Give it to a committee. Give it to the Methodist ladies. Give it a ribbon and a photograph and a name that wasn't his. And then it would stop being a promise kept in the dark and start being charity. And the children would know they were charity. And the whole clean thing of it would spoil. So he kept still. He kept the shade drawn. He let a widow he'd never met take the credit, and he was glad of it. Here is how he made a shoe. I want you to see it, because the town never did. He'd buy the uppers by the bundle, men's stock the factory had rejected, a bad seam, a scarred hide, a color nobody wanted, pennies on the dollar. Then he'd cut them down. That's the hard part, cutting a big thing small. He'd lay a child's worn sole on brown paper and trace it with a stub of pencil, and above his bench there were dozens of those tracings pinned in rows, each one a foot that had walked into his life for a night and out again. He skived the leather thin with a knife so old the handle had gone black. He cut soles out of automobile tires. There was a whole stack of bald tires in his back room, hauled there one at a time, because rubber lasts longer than leather and costs nothing but the labor of a man who has nothing but labor to give. The awl, the curved needle, wax thread he drew across a lump of beeswax till it shone. Iron lasts in children's sizes, a whole row of little iron feet, and where a poor cobbler got a set of children's lasts is a question the town might have asked, if the town had ever thought to ask anything. And there, on the corner of the bench, in the good light, stood one small shoe that was not a tracing, and not a template, and not for sale. A child's left shoe, only the left. The leather worn soft and pale, the toe scuffed through from some long ago dragging step. He kept it in the lamplight the way another man keeps a photograph on the mantel. It had belonged to his daughter. She died before the war. 4 years old, one winter. A fever that took 3 days about it, and there was no shoe to be got in that season that would have saved her, and no shoe that had anything to do with the fever at all, but a father's grief doesn't reason. She had walked out one whole shoe and half of the other before she stopped walking. He'd shipped out that spring with the left one in his coat, and he'd carried it through the mud and the shell and the long trip home. And he had it still. 61 children at the Pell County home, and every single pair he ever made was, in a way he never spoke aloud, for a girl who wore a size he'd never have to guess at again. That's the man who went out in the ice. Now, for a good long while the town went on, the way it always had. The season after the storm was mild, and mild seasons make people forget hard ones. The shoes hung on the fence most Fridays, and the children collected them, and Cora Halstead brought them inside and wrote nothing down, because she had long ago decided that a mystery that fed and shot her children was a mystery she'd rather keep than solve. She told herself she was protecting a shy benefactor. Truth is, she liked the saint. Everybody liked the saint. A saint asks nothing of you, but that you keep believing. Vernon Sload liked the saint most of all. There was an election coming, and Sload was a man who could smell an election the way a farmer smells rain. He never quite said the county board was behind the shoes. He was too careful for that. But he'd stand on those courthouse steps and talk about the charitable spirit this board has always encouraged, and he'd let his hand drift toward the general direction of the home, and folks filled in the rest for him. It cost him nothing. That was the kind of arithmetic Sload understood. A benefactor he could point to was worth 10 he couldn't. And a dead widow who'd moved away was the best kind of all, because she'd never show up to contradict him. So the whole county held a story that was wrong. And the only man who held the true one held it behind a drawn shade and said not a word. And above his bench the tracings multiplied, and on the corner the little shoe kept its watch. And that is exactly how things stood when the fence went bare. The first Friday, nobody thought much. Weather, maybe. The saint was allowed a late day now and then. It had happened before that scare in 35, and the shoes had come back. The second Friday the yard was quiet, in a way that isn't like children. They stood at the fence and looked at the empty picket, and didn't say the thing they were all thinking. Cora Halstead came out with her shawl pulled tight, and looked too, and she felt something turn over in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. 2 streets over, a woman who kept the house next to the shop mentioned to her husband that the cobbler's lamp hadn't burned in 5 nights. 5 nights. In all the years she'd lived beside that shop, the back lamp had burned every single night. Late, steady, a thing you set your bedtime by without knowing you did it. And now it was dark. And the front door, she said, had a skin of ice across the jamb like it hadn't been opened. Her husband went and knocked. No answer, of course. There'd never have been an answer to a knock, though he didn't think of that. He put his shoulder to the door and cracked the ice, and he went in, and he called out into a cold that was colder than the street. He found Elias Croft at his bench. He'd gone quietly. The doctor said pneumonia, said it had likely been coming for weeks, said the ice storm hadn't helped a man that age and that thin. He was sitting the way he always sat, hunched to the work, and on the bench in front of him was a finished pair of children's brogans, small, salvaged soles, the laces knotted twice, tied by those same laces to the leg of the workbench, ready to be carried out, and never carried. He'd made them, he'd meant to hang them. He just hadn't had another walk in him. Beside the shoes stood the little left shoe, pale in the dead lamp, and under his hand, open, was a ledger. Now the county has a way of dealing with a man who dies with nobody to claim him. There's a small mortgage on the shop. There's an estate, however poor, to be settled against it, and so they sent a clerk, Thomas Fenn, a careful young man with ink on his fingers and a ledger of his own, whose whole job that week was to count what a dead pauper had owned and set it against what a dead pauper had owed, and close the book on Ansel Street. Fenn came in with a lamp and a list. He noted the bench, the awl, the row of little iron lasts. He noted the stack of tires in the back and frowned at it. He noted a bundle of new sole leather and new upper stock. A great deal of it, more than a one-man shop would run through in a year, and he wrote that down and underlined it, because it didn't fit. And then he sat down in the dead man's chair to record the contents of the ledger, expecting accounts, expecting what he owed the leather merchant, expecting the sad short sums of a poor man's life. He opened it to the first page, and he stopped. It wasn't accounts. Or it was, but not of money. Down the left of every page ran dates. Down the middle ran sizes, child sizes, an 11, a 12, a 1, a 13, in a careful hand, a craftsman's hand, each figure formed slow and sure. And down the right, now and again, a word or two. Toes through, both soles gone. Left heel worn to nothing. Notes a man makes when he has measured a worn shoe by lamplight and is telling himself what the next one has to fix. Fenn turned a page, then another. The dates ran backward as he went forward, because the newest were at the front. This January, then December, then the fall, then back and back. He turned to the very first entry, and his lamp shook a little in his hand, because the first date at the top of the first page was not 1933, when the town first noticed the shoes on the fence. It was November of 1929. 4 years before anyone at the Pell County home ever looked up and wondered. 4 years he'd been doing it before it became a mystery worth having. And above that first entry, at the top of the first page set apart, was a single line written in a hand that shook worse than the rest. You could see the tremor in the ink. The pen pressed too hard, one line, and it read, "No child of this county walks the winter barefoot, while I have hands." Thomas Fenn sat in a cold shop with a dead man's book and did the thing he'd been sent to do. He counted. He counted every date, every size, every Friday down 8 winters of pages. And when he was done, he sat a while and didn't move. And then he closed the ledger very gently, the way you'd close a door on a sleeping child. And he took it up under his arm and walked out into the daylight. And the first place he went was not the courthouse. It was the home. Cora Halstead's kitchen smelled of boiled oats and lye soap, and the lamp was lit against the gray afternoon. Fenn set the ledger on the scrub table and turned it to her and asked her would she look at one line. Just one. He put his finger under a date and a size, February of 1934, and he read it out, the size and the day, and he asked her, did that mean anything to her? She looked at it a long moment. That's the week, she said slow. Ruthie Vane got her first whole pair of shoes. Her voice did a strange thing on the last word. Little thing had walked her toes clean through the old ones. I set them out by habit, the ruined ones, out on the fence Thursday, meant to throw them Friday. And Friday there was a new pair in her exact size. She looked up at Fenn. How is her exact size in this book? Because he measured the ones you set out, Fenn said. Every time. That's why they were never wrong. And you could see it land on her. All of it. Every Friday for 4 years that she had chosen not to question. Every worn pair she'd hung out from habit, and every new pair she'd carried in as a miracle. And the plain fact that a miracle had been a man, and the man had been reading the worn leather she left him like a letter, and answering it every week, and asking her for not one thing back, not even a name. Cora Halstead ran her finger down the column of Fridays, down 1 year and into the next and the next, her lips moving on the sizes like a woman saying a rosary, and she did not speak, and then she put her hand over her mouth and kept it there, and the lamp burned, and the oats went cold on the stove. Whose book is it? She got out at last. Fenn told her the name. She didn't know it. Almost nobody in Cardwell had ever troubled to know it. He was the deaf man on Ansell Street. That was all he'd ever been allowed to be. Now here is the part I've been carrying this whole story to tell you. Because a thing like this can't stay in a kitchen. Cora Halstead saw to that. She was a woman who'd chosen the comfortable story for 4 years. And when the true one was set in front of her, she found she couldn't live small anymore. She went to the county. She stood in front of Vernon Slode's own board, and she said there would be a proper accounting, out loud, in public, on the very steps where the whole thing had been guessed at and gotten wrong for years. And so they gathered. Half of Cardwell, it seemed like. The mill let out early. The children came from the home in a row, 61 of them, in shoes. You'll forgive me, but I have to say it, in shoes he'd made. And on the courthouse steps, the same steps where the men had said has to be the Ardsley widow and laughed off that deaf drunk on Ansell Street in the same breath, Thomas Fenn stood up with a ledger in his hands. A clerk. A man of records, the right man to read it, because a clerk reads a number and you believe him. He didn't make a speech. He said the shop on Ansell Street had been settled, and in it had been found this book, and he was going to read from it, and folks could judge for themselves. Then he began to read the Fridays. He read the first date, November of 1929, and the size beside it. Then the next. Then the next. He didn't hurry. He read them the way the man had lived them, one at a time, patient, no skipping. And somewhere in the crowd a woman started to count under her breath, and then a man beside her, and then it was half the steps counting out loud with the clerk, the number climbing as he read. 50 pairs. 100. He read on. The dates rolled through winters people in that crowd remembered. The bad freeze, the year the mill cut wages, the storm. Every Friday of every one of them. A size, a child, a note. Toes through, both souls gone. 200. 300. The crowd had gone dead quiet by then, except for the count. And the count had gone soft, almost afraid of itself, because everybody could feel where it was heading, and nobody quite believed a pair of hands could carry a thing that far. Thomas Fenn read the last Friday. The one tied to the leg of a workbench never hung. And he lifted his eyes off the book, and he said the number plain, so there'd be no mistake. 400 pairs. 400 pairs of children's shoes. One man. 8 winters, and then Fenn did one more thing. He turned the book back to the front, to that first page, and he read the line at the top, the one in the shaking hand. No child of this county walks the winter barefoot, while I have hands. And he told them whose hands. He said the name, Elias Croft. And he said the man had been deaf since a shell took his hearing in 1917, and that the great bulk of new leather in the shop, more than the man could ever have afforded on $5 a week of resoling, had been bought in the summer of 1936, with a stub still tucked in the back of the ledger. The stub of a veteran's bonus. $600 the government finally paid a soldier for the war. And the soldier had spent near every cent of it on sole leather and upper stock, so that a school's worth of children he would never meet could go shod through the coming winters. He'd lived on nothing. He'd skipped his own suppers the weeks the leather ran short, and he'd given a pair a week to strangers for 8 years and kept the only monument to it face down under a drawn shade. And he'd have kept it there forever if the ice hadn't taken him. I want to tell you now about a man standing in that crowd. Vernon Slode had come to speak. Of course he had. A gathering this size, an election this near, Slode had put on his good coat and worked up his remarks about the charitable spirit of this board. He'd been ready, at the right moment, to fold this saint into his own credit the way he'd folded the widow, the way he folded everything a man couldn't stand up and deny. Nobody asked him to speak. Fenn read the number, and the crowd turned, not to the commissioner, but to the row of children on the steps, and to the empty place where a dead man wasn't. And Vernon Slode stood there in his good coat, with his hat in his 2 hands, and he understood, slow and cold, that there was nothing he could say, that any word out of him would sound exactly like what it was, that the deaf drunk on Ansell Street he'd dismissed 100 times had outweighed him and his whole board, and every ribbon he'd ever cut, and had done it without once asking to be seen. Slode didn't get run out of town. Nobody threw anything. It was quieter and worse than that. He just stood in the crowd like any other man, holding his hat. And for the first time in his public life, Vernon Slode had the good sense to keep his mouth shut. His own silence was the whole of his sentence, and he served it standing up in front of everybody who'd ever believed him. And then there were the children. They'd been told, that morning, before the steps. Cora Halstead sat them down in the yard of the home, by the fence, and she told them the saint had a name, and the name was a man, and the man was gone. Some of them cried, the little ones, more from the weight of the grown-ups' faces than from understanding. But one of them didn't cry. A boy, older now, near grown, who went very still. Because years back, a boy had woke before dawn and seen a stooped shape tie a pair of shoes to the fence, and had thought, with the whole sure heart of a child, that he'd seen an angel. And later, older, he'd followed that shape one Friday all the way to the corner of Ansell Street and lost it at a dark cobbler's door, and told himself he'd been wrong. Because everyone knew that man was nobody. The town had told him so, and he'd believed the town over his own two eyes. He stood in the yard, and he understood, at last, that he had followed the shape to exactly the right door, that he'd been right the first time, as a child, half asleep, before the town got to him. It wasn't an angel. It was better. It was a man, a poor deaf man with a scarred face, walking out into the cold on ruined lungs to keep a promise nobody had asked him to make. The boy, the young man, put his hand on the fence rail and left it there a long time, on the very picket where the shape had knelt, and he didn't say anything either, and that was all right. Some things are too big for saying. He knew that now. He'd learned it from a man who never said a word. And little Ruthie Vane, not so little anymore, was given something that afternoon. From above the workbench, from the rows of brown paper tracings, they'd found the one marked with her sizes across 4 years, a whole ladder of her growing feet, drawn careful in a dead man's hand. And they'd found, kept with it, her own outgrown shoes, the ruined pair she'd walked her toes through, the pair set out on the fence one Thursday to be measured. He'd never thrown them away. He'd kept them, the template of her, the way he kept the other small shoe on the corner of the bench. They put them back in her hands. She held them, and she looked at the little tracings of the feet she used to have, and she understood that she had, in the smallest possible way, helped a saint do his work, that her worn shoes had taught his hands the shape of her. And I don't think that girl ever set that pair down again. Now let me tell you how it ends, because it does end, and it ends gentle. Come spring, 6 months on, they moved his bench. They took it out of the dark shop on Ansell Street, the shade up now, the light let in at last, and they carried it across town and set it in the front room of the Pell County Children's Home, in the good window, where the sun came in the mornings. The awl, the curved needle, the row of little iron lasts, the lump of beeswax gone smooth. And on the bench, open under a pane of glass, so small hands couldn't smudge it, they set the ledger. Any child who wanted to could stand on a stool and find the date and the size of the very pair he was wearing, in the hand of the man who'd made it, and read the line at the top that started the whole book. No child of this county walks the winter barefoot while I have hands. The little left shoe stays there too, on the corner where it always lived. Nobody at the home knows whose it was. They were never told. And I only tell you because you've come this far with me, and you've earned it. A father kept it 8 winters in the lamplight, and made 400 pairs in the shape of the grief it left him. That's the whole secret of the thing. Every shoe on that fence was a letter to a girl who'd stopped walking a long time ago. The fence still stands at the edge of the yard, and the town decided, the town that had gotten it so wrong for so long, that a pair would still hang there every Friday. Bought now with county money, out in the open, no mystery to it at all. And I'll give you one last dry line about Vernon Slode, because he earned it. At the next board meeting he rose and moved to double the home stipend, and he called it what this board always intended, and not one soul in that room corrected him. They let him have it. It was cheaper than the truth, and it fed the children. And maybe that's the closest a man like Slode ever comes to being shamed into decency. When he pays for the thing he mocked and calls it his own idea, and the shoes go on getting hung either way. So there it is. For 4 winters, for 8, really, if you count the ones nobody counted, the whole of Cardwell believed a saint left shoes on an orphanage fence. They were wrong about the saint. There wasn't one. There was a deaf cobbler on Ansel Street the town had written off as nobody, and he wasn't leaving miracles at all. He was keeping the book. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, do one small thing before you go. Tell me in the comments the name of your town. Just the town. So I know where all of you are listening from tonight. And the next time you pass a plain little shop with the lights on late, and a man inside bent over some quiet work that nobody's clapping for, you remember Elias Croft. Because the ones keeping the book are almost never the ones we're busy thanking. And every so often, a fence goes bare, and we finally learn who'd been filling it all along.